So there we were on press night in the interval, everyone who hadn't seen the show before exchanging notes about who they thought had done it, when after a protracted amount of time it was announced that the stage had unfortunately flooded and the performance would have to be cancelled. This was a continuation of something of a chaotic history that I've had with this show, and I'll tell you why at the end of this video. Oh my god, hey! Welcome back to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. My name is MickeyJo and I am obsessed with all things theatre. I'm also a professional theatre critic here in the UK, and this is my theatre-themed YouTube channel where I share video reviews of the shows that I have been invited to go and see. And today we are going to be talking all about the brand new West End musical Kathy and Stella Solve a Murder, currently playing at the Ambassadors Theatre in London. This show has now officially opened in the West End after unfortunately having to cancel the second act of its press night performance. I'll tell you why in just a moment, but I have had a chance to see the origins and development of this show because I first saw it at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival back in 2022, and then again in the summer of 2023 when it returned in a slightly expanded version. I saw the subsequent UK tour thereafter, and every time I've seen the show, including most recently, it's been developing more and more. In fact, when I first saw it, it was a one-act version. It is now two. That original production was staged in the round. This one now has a full fantastic set. It was originally a cast of 5 performers, and there are now 7, I believe, as well as 3 offstage understudies. But my point is that having that quite rare opportunity to watch this show throughout its development at various iterations of that has given me a very unique insight into its creative process and into this material, and positions me very well to talk about why certain things work. So I think I'm going to enjoy sharing this review with you today. Now, if you've seen this show already, either in its current West End run or any of those previous versions, let me know what you thought in the comments section down below. For those of you who haven't seen it yet, there is going to be one hefty spoiler right towards the end of this video. I'm going to do the whole thing without spoilers about the plot. It is also a whodunit, as you might imagine, and in the end, when I start talking about the performances and the individual cast members, to do justice to each of those performances, I am going to have to talk about some of the final revelations in the show. So once we get to that end section, there will be spoilers. Until then, you're fine. And if you enjoy this video review, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel or follow me wherever you're seeing or hearing this. Shout out to anyone listening to this as a podcast. That's actually quite meta because you right now are listening to a podcast in which I review a musical about a podcast. I'm like a theatrical snake eating my own tail over here, and let me tell you, it does not taste bad. But if you do want to stay abreast of all of my upcoming West End and Broadway reviews, make sure you're subscribed with those notifications turned on. Many exciting videos coming very soon. But for now, let's talk about Kathy and Stella. Who are they, and do they make for a good show? Let's find out. So if you're wondering if you ought to already know the names Kathy and Stella from somewhere, you don't need to. They are new characters for this completely original show. This is not based on an existing book or film. This is a new narrative co-written by John Britton, who co-wrote the book and the lyrics, as well as being one of the show's co-directors, with Fabian Aloise, who co-directs as well as choreographing, and Matthew Floyd Jones, who wrote the music and lyrics, co-wrote the music and lyrics. It's a big old multi-hyphenate collaborative process over at Kathy and Stella, let me tell you. But it's set in Beverley near Hull, which if you don't know UK geography, neither do I, honestly, but it's north somewhere. It's up in that direction where my upstairs neighbours live, where we meet 2 best friends since primary school, Kathy and Stella. Now, they are true crime fanatics, and they are also the co-hosts of their own podcast, Kathy and Stella's Murder Podcast, which when we meet them is not particularly successful, and though they have a small collection of engaged fans, it isn't really bringing them much success, opportunity, or financial reward. But they're immediately very endearing, very charming characters whose success we root for, so when we find out that there is external pressure from their families to get a job and stop doing the silly podcast, you know, we want them to succeed, and we find out they have this sort of an I want opportunity at the beginning of the show because they are meeting with a successful true crime author named Felicia Taylor, who is doing a book signing event and looking for new talent for her soon-to-be-announced podcast network. Little do they know that meeting is going to see them soon embroiled in a world of real-life murder. And as the title of the show suggests, they find themselves, though they are not necessarily professionally equipped to do so, solving an actual murder. And it's another of those stories where plucky everyday individuals get involved, despite the police suggesting that their intervention wouldn't be helpful, but with a regional British flair, and also with songs. Now, I would describe the quality of this score as being very musical theatre, both the nature of the music as well as the comedy tone, very familiar of the comedian Victoria Wood, if you know her work. If anyone's familiar with Acorn Antiques, the musical, very much a similar vibe going on here. It also has sort of pastiche moments, but it's neither really classical nor particularly contemporary. It does just have that sort of timeless musical theatre sound, a little like Operation Mincemeat, kind of similar musical vibes there. Comedy-wise, this equips itself with some of the more modern sensibilities of like current zany, like Star Kid-esque comedy, while also feeling very British, like a little bit Victoria Wood, a little bit Catherine Tate, a little bit like Dave, Mock the Week, Taskmaster-esque even. And what I enjoy about this material is that through this mystery plot and on the other side of the thing, it tells an important story about friendship, and we start to have a conversation about why they're as interested in true crime as they are. That conversation doesn't go to a super in-depth or meaningful place because it's still a light-hearted comedy show, but, you know, it addresses the topic. It also talks about the responsibility of true crime reporting and podcasting and, you know, the responsibility that you have to the victims and in real time and all of these things as well, but again, in a very tongue-in-cheek way. That being said, like on Operation Mincemeat, there are a couple of moments where we indulge in a little bit more seriousness, and this is something that the show really didn't have in its earliest incarnations, and a quality that it's attained over time, and I will tell you a little bit more about that when I talk about how well it does certain things in the next section. While we're still talking about the material though, I enjoy this script very much. I think it's very funny, and the lyrics are very funny, which I think is key to a comedy musical. If you can't write comedy through song, then the thing may as well be a comedy play. We have seen shows before where audiences have felt a little bit perplexed by a disconnect between a very funny script and like heartfelt song lyrics that don't seem to continue that same comedic feel. This, however, and perhaps due to the collaborative writing process, has that same comedy tone from the scenes into the songs, and that's a really great thing. There's a lot of stuff that's really funny because of the way that it's characterized. There's a lot of really well-written one-liners. They extract an awful lot of humor about sort of like the modern perspective on dubious police work, and Stella in particular having this distrust of the police, who, when they first encounter them, she is convinced that they're about to be set up. There's also a little bit of multi-rolling written into the show, as there always has been, and there is less in this most recent version, because it used to be that 3 of the members of the original 5-person cast played multiple different characters among themselves, and now there are 5 additional cast members alongside Kathy and Stella who share out these roles, and the multi-rolling makes a little bit more sense. Anyway, that's a little bit about the material. I will tell you about some of my favourite songs, but I'm going to do it in the next section, where I tell you what I thought of the show. So I really enjoy Kathy and Stella Solve a Murder. I always have. I've enjoyed it since that first version, and it's because of that comedic quality that it has, and every single version of the show that I've seen has had these two as Kathy and Stella, and so much of why the show works is this central pair of characters and the rapport that these two have, and this very believable friendship that you root for. You come to care quite deeply, not necessarily about the success of their podcast, nor about them solving this murder, really, but just about the two of them being able to stay friends amidst challenging circumstances. But it's a really charming show, delivering musical comedy very well, and since the beginning I've seen it take so many brilliant steps in the right direction, and I think it's fantastic. The first time I saw it, I was like, this is great, I love this material, I want it to have a very different set, I don't like it in the round, I want it to feel like we're in Kathy's mum's garage, and all the other locations that we experience throughout the show come out of that, and they're sort of are born from that location, and that's the exact set that they ended up creating. It's one of my favourite set designs. Actually, let me tell you about the creative responsible for that. That is the work of Cecilia Carey, who is also the costume designer, which I also enjoy. Expressive use of colour, brilliant use of jumpsuits. But this is also, I think, probably one of the most impressive sets you will see on the stage of the Ambassadors Theatre in your entire life, because it's a very small space. And they managed to fit this set on stage, this cast on stage, the band on stage. They create all of these different locations. It's vivid, it's colourful, it's bright. They have this brilliant chalkboard at the background with strings and little bulbs that light up and are used throughout different musical numbers with lighting cues. There's a sequence at the start of, or towards the start of the second act, where we go to an event called MurderCon, which is this big true crime fan convention, and the set reveal that they do for that is thrilling. Just in general, the extent of what the production has become, I think, is really worthy of the brilliance of the material, and it's great to see those two things getting upskilled simultaneously, because the material has also grown substantially. Like I said, this used to be a one-act show, it has become a two-act show, and I want to talk to you about what has been added in that process. So there was, from what I can remember, definitely a general fleshing out of the first act, and we paused a little bit more in the early moments of Kathy and Stella's research when they're trying to figure out what to do, and they very quickly come to the realization that they have no idea what they're doing when faced with a legitimate ongoing criminal investigation. But where the show has really expanded and found this new dimension is in a couple of moments in the second act. This is where you'll find most of the new material since the original Edinburgh Fringe run, and there are moments of sentimentality, some of which play better than others. Let me explain why. So having met these characters and learned about these characters, they go on something of a journey throughout the first act. Again, I'm trying not to give you any spoilers, and we see a little bit of a friction in their friendship, and they start to move in different directions because they want different things, and we can realise that. Now, at the start of the second act, having met them as friends already, we flash back to the first time that they met as primary school children in year 5, on the swings together, a young Kathy reading Heads Will Roll, a grisly true crime book that we know will become the favourite true crime book of both of them, written by Felicia Taylor, who we met in the first act. And this friendship continues with us seeing this friendship blossoming and seeing the two supporting each other and relying on each other, and we see the way that they came to form a podcast. That opens the second act, and then we go into the MurderCon sequence. Now, they added this flashback for the UK tour post the second Edinburgh Fringe run, and I think it's very valuable, and I like that it comes after the fact of us having met them and after the fact of them developing this sort of a friction, because it contradicts where we know they come to be eventually. So there's that sense of the audience being aware of a future that they don't yet glimpse for themselves. At the same time, I don't love where it falls in the show specifically, because at the end of the first act we get this little bit of a sinister cliffhanger that ends with the words "See you at MurderCon." The audience is poised by definition for the second act to open with this MurderCon sequence, and MurderCon would be a stronger opening act just tonally, just because of what it is. It's this loud, flashy, bright, uplifting source of energy, which is what we need an Act 2 opener to be. Act 2 openers are very tricky, and we have to bring the audience back in at this energy level, and MurderCon would be a great way to do that. It also, like, there are comic moments throughout this flashback segment, like there are jokes in it, but it's more sort of charmingly funny and wittily funny rather than MurderCon, which I think gets bigger laughs because it's just more high energy and ridiculous. In summation, what I think might have been a slightly stronger version of this is if we did open with the MurderCon sequence, and then one of the scenes within that is Kathy and Stella, they have this Q&A. And they're not sure what to say because of the circumstances that they found themselves in, and then the Q&A takes a little bit of a turn. But before it does, I think if there were to be a couple of questions along the lines of like, when did you two first meet? And then we see that flashback sequence, and then we hear a question like, and how did you form the podcast? And then we see that other part, and so every scene we get from the retrospective segment that originally was at the top of the second act was instigated by a question from the Q&A, I feel like that would fall in a better place, and it would represent, rather than sort of sitting at the lowest point of their friendship as a memory of what it was, it would begin to represent a turning point and the possibility that they might come back together again. Only it gets interrupted by what happens next. I feel like that's just a stronger progression of events to me. The other new material that's been added is for a police character named Sue Shaw, who gets a song talking about professional responsibility and the idea of wanting to be a hero and that being unrealistic, and it's quite a somber and heartfelt moment. And that's something that I enjoy about this show, and that's something that I find rewarding in comedy shows when they surprise you with sentimentality like this. Operation Mincemeat does the same thing to tremendous effect with Dear Bill. However, the brilliance of Mincemeat's moment is that it comes immediately out of ridiculousness and insincerity and comedy. Like, they are still making hilarious jokes right up until the start of that song, so it takes you completely by surprise and you're not prepared for that kind of a moment. With Kathy and Stella, this comes after a lot of arguing, and this particular argument has gone around and around and around in circles, and I think just goes on too long because it just begins to feel a little bit heavy. So rather than being on this comic high and then suddenly taking a left turn into something surprisingly somber and serious, we just sort of descend slowly towards it, and you can feel the energy begin to dip down in the first half of the second act. They have a big uplift at the end of the second act. The climax of the whole thing is really rewarding and really funny and just really well written, but you do feel a discernible dip in the second act, and it stops us being able to enjoy that number, no matter how well written it is or how well performed it is, because of what comes before it. I think on balance my favourite song might be Part of the Story, just because it so brilliantly encapsulates through the journey that they go on in this song their relationship to murder and to true crime, and there is a little brief moment of seriousness where they reflect on the inherent dangers that women face and why it sort of sparked this morbid fascination for them with grisly murder for their entire lives. But almost as soon as we've got there, we turn a corner and it turns back into this hilarious revelation that they're just very excited to be part of the story and to be involved in this murder case despite the fact that someone has been killed. A brilliant comic twist that is also reflected in the very last lyric of the song, when they spend the whole thing excitedly singing about being part of the story, and then the final lyric is an addendum to that where they sing, and it's also very sad that she's been murdered. So much of the score is very, very catchy, I will say. They have a couple of ballad moments. Kathy and Stella sing a song about their friendship and about their codependency called If I Didn't Have You, open brackets, I Would Die, close brackets. And there's another brilliant song in the first act that they both sing called The Approval of Strangers, where Stella gets this sort of like a lounge singer, jazzy vibe as she is reflecting on the nice comments that she is reading from people on the internet and the validation that she's getting from that. It has these beautifully ironic lyrics, but it's also just a lovely melody. What I love as well and find particularly interesting is that Kathy and Stella as characters have, if not a motif, then a very specific style to when they are singing together, and especially in delivering the podcast. So the quality of the song Kathy and Stella's Murder Podcast that we hear at the start of the first act is very close to the song that we hear at the start of the second act when we are flashing back to their childhood, called Read About a Murder. Kathy and Stella's Murder Podcast. You want to read about a murder with me? They're both very bouncy, very light-hearted. The difference with the one in the second act is that it feels decidedly more juvenile. They've made it feel deliberately childish. It kind of sounds like a children's TV show theme, but whenever they sing together about the podcast, it does have this sort of a jingle quality. So does the song that comes at the end of the show, See You Next Murder. It has that same light-hearted feel with a little bit of bounce. And so I think this is another score that's actually deceptively clever in its composition. Reflecting back on the direction of the whole thing by John Britton and Fabian Eloise, I think the multi-rolling and how it's now utilised, like I said before, is much stronger because there is a connection between the characters played by the same person, or it's brief enough that it's just a little cameo and it doesn't really matter as much. I also want to praise the personality with which the show has been staged, because just looking at this material and looking at this sort of a Victoria Wood, slightly retro kind of a comedy piece, it would feel as though you would want to do it with a lot more stillness. But this is something that's very on its feet. It's very lively and fast-paced, and you have people literally running around this space constantly in this ensemble, coming in and out, and a lot of moving set pieces and a lot of visual chaos. And I think that works for this. I think it also works for a contemporary audience, and it doesn't make the thing feel dated. And because we're spending time developing these characters, it doesn't deliver as much plot as a lot of other whodunits. Like, we don't go down as many of these side roads, we don't explore as many of these red herring possibilities. A criticism I've seen leveled at this show is to do with its pacing, but I think that's necessary in order to eke out the comedy from these moments and really get to know Kathy and Stella as substantially as we do. And I think a nice foil to the narrative moving quite slowly is the brilliant speed of the direction and the staging and the choreography. So well done to that creative team. That's a choice for this show that may not have seemed obvious, but I believe paid off. Now, in this next section, I'm going to tell you about the show's performances, and it's in this section that I am going to have to spoil the ending of the thing. If you don't want to know who done it, if you don't want spoilers for this show, I beseech you, do not watch this last section. You can probably skip to the next section after this one, where I'm going to talk about what happened on press night and why my relationship with this show is disastrous, but just skip past the performances part. So we have to start by talking about Bronté, Barbé and Rebekah Hinds, who play Kathy and Stella. Truly as fantastic as each other in these roles. These characters are so fleshed out and developed, and they have been since day one, honestly. Like, since the first time I saw this show, they've been giving these fantastic performances, and they've changed slightly, and they've become a little more characterized and a little more thorough, but for the most part, like, they had a really great grip on them from the beginning. What they also have is a brilliant chemistry and a rapport between the two of them. Like I've told you many times in this review, you root for this relationship, you care about their friendship, which is vital. What I really enjoy in the newly expanded version of the show is that we get a little bit more insight into the differences between them, and it's allowed them to become more of their own people. Like, they very clearly had different personalities in the first iteration of the show, Kathy being the more cautious and apprehensive, and Stella being a little more bullish and headstrong. We now find out a little more about why that is, both in the new material, in the sort of the ongoing timeline, as well as in those flashback moments. We find out that Kathy has had historic struggles with anxiety, but has always had this very detail and fact-oriented fascination with true crime, which sort of explains some of the other aspirations we come to find out that she has during the show. Stella, meanwhile, has a very comic personality, and this isn't something that I feel was necessarily acknowledged in the first version. Perhaps it was and I've forgotten. But within the context of a comedic show, it goes without saying that all of your characters are funny, and you don't actually have to necessarily acknowledge within that world that somebody is funny. But in the newer versions of the show, they talk about Stella being hilarious and Stella having a very funny personality, which she does, and she has a brilliantly dry delivery that comes with that, and just fantastic accent. The accent work is what makes the two of them so very funny. Like, that same charm that Wallace and Gromit have, I feel like these two, that is said with nothing but love. I love Wallace and Gromit, and there is something about a very sincerely and charmingly delivered regional British accent that it's just charm. It delivers an awful lot of charm. But like I said, we acknowledge in this one that Stella is very funny, and we sort of find out from her past that she maybe craves this validation, and so it makes sense as to how she interprets the love that they come to find as being the podcast hosts, basically. When the thing becomes more successful, that's what's motivating her to sing the song Approval of Strangers, and why she makes some bad decisions at the end of the first act. Rebekah as Stella, I think, gets the lion's share of the punchlines, but it's Bronté's vulnerability and fragility that really sells the rift between them growing, and the arguments that they have, because she is the more timid and, like, maybe a little bit of a pushover. So when she comes to talking back to Stella, and when they begin to have these full arguments, you really feel the gravity of that and the weight of that. I also want to say before we move on, they are both fantastic vocalists. We knew this about Bronté already, who was just recently seen as Catherine Plummer in the original London company of Newsies, but Rebekah Hinds has this beautiful, not necessarily like typical musical theatre in the same way, but like jazzy, soulful quality to her voice, which this score exploits brilliantly. Like I said, Approval of Strangers is not just a funny song, she also sounds fantastic crooning the thing. It's full of all of these very smooth scoops, it's just velvety and delicious. Anyway, less than shocking news, Kathy and Stella are brilliant in Kathy and Stella. It's the supporting cast which has always made this show even more interesting. Now unfortunately, because of the timing of this run, Jodie Jacobs, who has been a standout of not only the supporting cast but of the entire show throughout its development from that first Edinburgh Fringe run, every other time that I had seen the show, she has joined the London company of Hello Dolly this summer at the London Palladium, so was not able to appear in this production. And that is a shame because few people can do exactly what Jodie Jacobs does to the same extent. Like, Jodie is fantastic. That being said, I really enjoy the new members of the cast joining for this run at the Ambassadors, and I think they bring very different qualities to the role, and in particular, the different characters that Jodie played being split into more than one performer, I think really works. Let me tell you about the performers taking on those roles. So first of all, we have Hannah Jane Fox, who plays Felicia Taylor, the true crime author who, spoiler alert, is murdered shortly after telling Kathy and Stella that they don't have what it takes to join her podcast network. She later also comes back as Felicia Taylor's sister, and then as Felicia Taylor's brother, Horatio, who is an anti-true crime activist. And so restricting it to her just playing those roles where she looks like the same person, and it's like, I'm not Felicia, and they think she's Felicia every time. They're like, Felicia Taylor, and she's like, no, I'm actually Felicia's sister. I'm actually Felicia's brother. Like, that's a better source of comedy than having her in between each of those coming back on as the police inspector, which is what used to happen. Hannah Jane also does a terrific job and plays it very differently to Jodie. It's quite showbiz, it's quite a diva performance. There's the occasional moment where the diva-esque sort of Ethel Merman-y vocal delivery makes us lose the clarity of what she's saying just a little bit, but it only happens very fleetingly. Hannah Jane is still a scene stealer in this role. She's still a riot. Hannah Jane is still a scene stealer in this role. She's still a riot, as are many of the others. Elliot Broadfoot, I very much enjoy as Justin Norris. I also really enjoy Ben Redfern, who plays David Slatter, who we meet in the show as a red herring suspect, who is just like super creepy and a very believable murderer. And this is another role where previously Slatter and Justin were both played by the same performer. And again, in separating them, it gives the opportunity to cast with people who are even more in each extreme rather than like brilliantly versatile performers who can do both things, but it meant that we could have an even creepier Slatter, and I really like what that number has become when he performs a number called If I Did It, which is giving me like the title of the O.J. Simpson book about not having killed his wife, but if he did, here's how he did it, that whole thing. Because they've reframed it, I don't think this was always the case, as a karaoke night at the pub where they've gone to interview him, the pub that he is the owner or the manager of, and he is performing it on the bar, and the way that he's incorporating choreography, and he's got a microphone, and there's a little bit of like a Cher reference in it. Love all of that. Like, it's ridiculous and campy and over the top and creepy and brilliant. Elliot Williams Endure, meanwhile, plays Detective Inspector Sue Shaw, and this is another one where, because it's not one performer, Jodie Jacobs, playing all of these roles, you get to cast someone with a very different interpretation, who is a lot more stern, gets the comedy to work in a very different way, really accesses the heart of it in that sequence in the second act when she is singing about responsibility and policing. I really enjoy her performance. I think it's this grounding force and this straight man to the over-the-top ridiculousness of everyone else, and everyone else gets to be even more ridiculous and over-the-top because you have this separate person playing this more serious character, and because they're separated, it works for me. But finally, if you're wondering where those whodunit spoilers are, here they are, because if you want to know who the murderer is, it is Imelda Warren Green's character. So Imelda briefly plays Stella's older sister, but principally she plays a morgue technician named Erica, who when we first meet her is revealed to be Kathy and Stella's incredibly enthusiastic fan. And though we don't really have any reason to suspect her of any wrongdoing, by the end of the show we come to find out that she is the one who beheaded Felicia Taylor and subsequently guided Kathy and Stella throughout the investigation towards a conclusion. And she is brilliant enough throughout the show, giving us this like hysterical fan, but particularly when she comes back and ambushes and tries to murder them in Kathy's mum's garage at the climax of the whole thing, and is getting hysterical and crazed and murderous, and it then descends into this like Edwin Drood style moment where she's singing this murderous confession that turns a little bit Lady of the Lake from Spamalot, like pastiche again, a little bit Cher, a little bit Elvis, very like Barbara self-indulgent. It's just hysterically ridiculous, sold largely due to the fact that no other human being I've seen has this much energy on stage. Like, at times, because her performance has grown since I first saw it, I thought it was getting a little bit too much, and now I think it's just perfect. I think it needed a West End stage to really appreciate the size and the scale and the broadness of this comedy performance. She really is a winning standout among this fantastic company, and it's just absolutely bonkers in the best possible way. And I had to tell you this because I wouldn't be able to do justice to describing her performance and to reviewing her performance if I couldn't tell you how wonderful she is playing the full scope of the role. If I had to just like be like, oh, she's quite funny, by the way. No, I needed to tell you, Imelda is sensational in this show. So I'll finish up by talking about who I think should go and see this show, but first let me tell you what happened on press night and why I think that I have cursed Kathy and Stella personally. So first of all, let's go back to the Edinburgh Fringe. First time I saw it, it was in the round in a tent outside of Summer Hall, the Paynes Plough tent, and there was a sound issue halfway through the show, so we had a show stop, which is not something that happens often at the Edinburgh Fringe, and everything's on a pretty tight schedule, so that tends to have more of an impact. But while we were waiting for the show to resume, the pianist started playing just like incidental music that turned into an impromptu audience sing-along. Like I think there was ABBA. And then the next time we saw it in Edinburgh, there was a little bit of a sound issue again, and Erin and I were like, oh no, is there going to be another show stop? There wasn't. We saw it in Bristol, it was fine, and then we saw it in the West End. First act, fine. Interval, suspiciously long. Announcement at the end of the interval, they wouldn't be able to perform the second act, but we're inviting everyone to come back and see it another time, which I subsequently did. And by that point, I'd seen the show enough times, and between Bristol and London, there wasn't a huge change other than the new cast members, but I was happy to go back and see it again. So I've now seen it 1.5 times in the West End. And funnily enough, for everyone who hasn't had an opportunity to go back, they are doing a Act 2 only performance on Wednesday afternoon next week for the guests at press night who want to find out what happens in the end of the show, which I think is hilarious and mad. But without going into the specific details of like exactly what happened, it was just a little bit of backstage chaos that took a little bit of time to resolve. Everything is fine now, and there is no reason that anyone should be concerned about booking tickets to go and see Kathy and Stella solve a murder in the West End. Truly, I think this is a great show for all ages. I think you can take a family, not like very young kids, because it's still like it's slightly more adult humor, but it's a great show to take like a group of friends who aren't convinced if they normally like musicals, because everyone likes to laugh. You can do this on a date night. I think this would be a great date night. It gives you something to talk about in the interval because you can speculate about who you think done it, all that good stuff. But I think it also does the true crime thing very well, and it's not like trying to depict true crime to the same authentic extent on stage, which is probably a good thing. It's just sort of poking fun, but also paying respect to it. So if you find yourself at the intersection of musical theatre fan and true crime lover, it's as though this show was created for you, and I can recommend you go and see it. But I can recommend it to a lot of people. Those have been my thoughts about Kathy and Stella Solve a Murder, now playing at the Ambassadors Theatre, right across from the Mousetrap, funnily enough, in the West End. Go and check it out if this sounds like something you would enjoy. And if you've seen it already, like I said before, let me know in the comment section down below what you thought of the show. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my theatre-themed YouTube channel, turn on those notifications so you don't miss my upcoming West End and Broadway reviews, or follow me wherever you are seeing or listening to this review. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day.
For 10 more seconds, I'm MickeyJoTheatre. Oh my god, hey, thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!